Hello and welcome back to the Eyes of O Gaming channel for another game review. Today we're taking a look at a sequel to a game that we've actually already looked at on the channel and was one of the first reviews that was uploaded. And just quickly before we get started, I wanted to say a really big thank you to everyone. The channel has recently passed 2,800 subscribers, and obviously this wouldn't happen without all of you, so thank you so much for your support. So this time we're taking a look at Senua Saga Hellblade 2. And like I already mentioned, this is a sequel game which takes place after Senua's Sacrifice Hellblade, or I guess it's Hellblade 1 now. This particular review is going to be a little bit different than my typical style of doing reviews, as I'm going over it much sooner after release than typical, which can usually be 5 years to a decade or more after release. But since I did enjoy the first Hellblade release, I wanted to get to this one, and so here we are. Okay, so Hellblade 2 was released in 2024 and published by Xbox Game Studios and developed by Ninja Theory. So what is Hellblade 2, and does it hold up as a sequel to Hellblade 1? And most importantly, is this one worth it for you? Let's see if we can answer that question for you. Let's get into it. Okay, so let's set up the plot for this one. Throughout the review, I'm going to assume that you've already played Hellblade, or at least don't mind spoilers for that game. If you do prefer to start with the first game in the series, I'll make sure that there's links or something popping up on the screen for Hellblade and that review. So with that said, I am going to try to avoid major spoilers for Hellblade 2. So the game takes place in the 9th century, and you play as Senua, a native to the Orkney Islands. This Hellblade sequel takes place at some point after the first Hellblade, though I'm not sure it's officially stated how long it's been. My guess is that it's been a few years, but no more than 10. Sorry it's such a wide range, but it's really hard to tell. Do keep in mind that this is just my perspective, but in Hellblade 1 she seemed to be at the oldest maybe in her early 20s. Now I get the impression that she's supposed to be in mid to late 20s. The game itself is going to begin with Senua captured by slavers and headed to Iceland. From there, you're essentially going to be traveling around Iceland, playing through the story. As with Hellblade, there's going to be an emphasis on mythology or supernatural concepts if you prefer, as well as the ongoing struggles that Senua will have within her own mind. Just as in Hellblade 1, Senua hears voices, but also is prone to hallucinations and other afflictions. Again, if you've played through the first Hellblade, you'll be familiar with this concept, and the level of care and detail that the developers put in to immerse the player into her world and how she experiences it. And what can we compare this one to? Well, obviously Hellblade. A lot of the concepts are going to carry over, including Senua's mental state and the story-driven nature of the game. There is combat, but just like in Hellblade, it's not really the focus. However, I would say that the combat has been really stepped up in the presentation. It's still not going to be the most challenging thing from a gameplay perspective, but personally it felt like the combat just had a lot more weight to it, and there's more of a realistic feel to it all. Keep in mind that much of the concepts are going to be fantasy, and it is still a game, so it's not going to be completely realistic. It just has some quality about it that seems to feel a little bit more realistic than last time around. Aside from the combat and story similarities with the original, puzzles and progression are also going to have much in common with Hellblade. For example, needing to change your position to get a different visual perspective in order to find the hidden secret or open secret passages. Other than the original Hellblade, I also feel like Rise Son of Rome has some similar aspects. They're both going to have a cinematic gameplay feel, and even the combat has some common elements, though Rise feels a lot more like standard gameplay combat, rather than Hellblade 2, which really leans into the combat as a cinematic experience. That said, I feel like they still both have quite a bit in common, both being story-driven games, progressing through zones, and using combat as a means to break up the story, rather than the typical gameplay loop of story breaking up the combat. The only other game that I want to mention right now is Plague Tale Requiem. I chose this one over the original as combat is more of a focus, but again, it's a game that really relies on story to keep the player interested, with combat basically just being there to break up the story and not really being the focal point. As always, I also invite you to leave your own comparable games down in the comments for other players to check out. We've got a third-person action-adventure game here. As I've spent most of the review hammering down on already, the focus is on the story. However, you will run into a fair amount of combat as you progress through the game. The combat itself is fairly simple to engage in. Mostly it's just going to be based on timing instead of hitting combos or something like that from similar types of games. A lot of the time you're going to be trying to use your enemy's attacks against them, basically timing evasion or blocking and then parrying against them. Outside of the combat, there's also an emphasis on focusing as Senua. This is done to find hidden things like faces in the environment, which will then unlock hidden paths or finding runes in a zone. The runestones being used as a story device has also returned from the first game as well. The narrator is going to pop in and tell you some mythology or something that ties into the story.
The Skald's verse tells how Grettir made many enemies with his proud and overbearing nature.
Senua's personal mental struggles are also going to be making a return from the first game. Hearing voices that either help you to figure out a puzzle or could make you second guess your actions. There's also going to be some puzzle solving throughout the game, again finding some runes in the environment as well as some other concepts. But for the most part it's all going to be pretty straightforward as far as puzzle solving goes. As I've already mentioned, the combat is very simple in this game, but I did feel like the controls were intuitive and it seemed to have a weight to it that wasn't present in the previous game. Strikes or attacks seem to feel a little bit more impactful and immersive than previously, but take this with a grain of salt as that was my experience and it may vary between different players. Aside from that, the weather and lighting is also going to play some role in how the game plays out, such as obscuring your view or needing torches to light your way. This is a highly cinematic game, and as such it's easy to tell that a lot of work was put into the graphical experience. Hellblade 2 goes for a fairly high realism approach, though there is some mythologic and fantasy element to it. This isn't a high fantasy setting game. There's going to be mythological elements, but it's not a game full of magic or flying around or typical fantasy creatures. For the most part, things are going to be representations of real-world settings and objects. The locations themselves aren't going to have a ton of variation. Typically, you're always going to be somewhere Nordic and cold, though you do get a little bit of variation when going through cave systems or having changes in weather. There are also a few notable exceptions and special locations, but the vast majority is cold Nordic environment, which makes sense for where the game takes place. In my opinion, the NPCs are designed well and the environments in the game look truly beautiful. The descriptions are obviously fairly subjective though, so of course use the visuals of the gameplay to see what I mean, and decide for yourself if this is the type of style that appeals to you. I think that the most obvious unique aspect of this game is the psychological depth it explores. As far as I know, this is the only franchise that really delves into mental health struggles at this level with a protagonist. As you play through the story, you have ever-present voices that Senua will hear, which will either be helpful for solving puzzles or may have you second-guess what you should be doing in a particular instance. The cinematic nature of the game is also a fairly unique aspect. Other than the Hellblade series, the only game that I've played which has the same level of blending cinematic with real-time things, such as combat, is in the game Rise, which I mentioned previously in the comparable games section. The combat itself is all fairly simple, and the focus is definitely on the story in this game. Personally, I didn't really run into much for bugs, a couple of minor audio bugs, but really nothing game-breaking and nothing that prevented me from enjoying the experience. In terms of sound, there's actually a lot going on in Hellblade 2. The music I found to be fitting and quite good. Sound effects are all done very well, and the voice acting is at a high caliber to tie it up nicely. Throughout the game, you're going to have both the voices that Senua hears, as well as a narrator of the story, which will be used to flesh things out as well as giving insights into the mythology. Once you finish your initial playthrough of the game, you can also choose different narrators. I don't want to go too deep into this as it does feel somewhat spoilery, but essentially you get to choose from characters in the game, which will give you some interesting perspective and might be worth doing a replay to hear as you play through. If you're able to, I do highly recommend playing with headphones, as the sound quality is really quite good, and the directional sound will add another layer to the game. I'll play some examples of the audio here so you can decide for yourself how you feel about it.
What's happening? Just watch this happen. Do something. Stop. Just stand by and watch. Fight him. Why didn't you stop it? Too weak.
Let her die.
What about that path above?
Maybe you can get a better view from it.
Find a better view.
Find it.
Call him. Let him go. Don't fear him. Don't let us die here. She has to survive.
You must.
You are the one. Find us. It's time to give up, child. Leave this land.
No. What you did to me, I see it here. They are cowed like I was. Lost like I was. Believing what they're told. Sacrifices. Spilling blood for a lie.
I speak the truth.
And now with the general look at the game done, let's get into opinions and subjective territory. I'm going to keep this short, but I just want to mention a couple of things. If you've seen some of the other reviews, you know the deal, but for new people, don't expect a number rating or something like that because I don't believe in them. The point is to show you the game and let you decide for yourself. Not everyone is going to enjoy every game, and your experience will be subjective and personal. That said, now that I've gone over the game in general, I'm just going to talk a little bit about my own experience for those interested. Please keep in mind that whether I enjoyed the game or not doesn't mean that you will or won't. You should make your decision on whether to give it a try based on the breakdown done in the first part of the review. So did I enjoy Senua Saga, Hellblade 2?
I liked it. I happen to like it.
Yes, quite a bit actually. The game is going to feel a little light on the gameplay side. Keep in mind that this one plays out more like an interactive movie style of game, so what that means in a practical sense is the combat is extremely simplified, and if you're an avid gamer, the combat is likely going to offer up zero challenge for you. It all just typically relies on timing, but this isn't a Dark Souls style game by any means. The combat in the game mostly just serves as another of the storytelling devices, and to break up the cinematic sequences. As for the story itself, I thought it was really quite good and kept me interested the whole way through. What really surprised me when I started this review is the number of negative reviews I've seen about it. Quite a few of the complaints that I've seen is that it's not as good as the original, or that they felt that the graphics were not performing well. As for the graphics, I played on console, the Xbox Series X, and I thought the graphics were really quite good and didn't run into many issues. From the gameplay that I featured in this video, maybe you'll see things that I didn't, but personally I thought it all was looking really quite good and optimized for the console. Of course, that doesn't mean there aren't optimizations for the computer. I didn't actually try it on there, so I don't know. And if you have an older computer that can't handle some of it, you might dip in frames or quality. But again, on console I didn't see this as being an issue. As for the people saying that it's not as good as the original, I just don't see where people are coming from. I personally felt like this was a great continuation of the story. And really, if you were someone that enjoyed the first one, I'm not sure what this one is missing, and I would expect that you would enjoy this one as well. If you are one of the people who really loved the first game but didn't like this one at all, please let me know in the comments your opinion, as personally I just don't see the issue. I do really enjoy how this series infuses the Norse mythology into the game, taking the stories from the myths and drawing parallels to the story that they're trying to tell in this game. Personally, I'm very interested in Norse mythology, and so likely this is something that biases me to enjoy the game, but I would suspect that if you also enjoy history and mythology, this will likely appeal to you as well. I also found the character Senua to be interesting and is a nice change from the standard cookie-cutter character. Many games in recent years have been getting a lot of criticism as they try to push things to be more diverse and represent people aside from the basic hero of classic games. And at times it can feel really quite forced. And in some of those instances, I do find it difficult to disagree with some of the critiques. But in this case, I think they really did it right. Senua is a troubled character, and she really does not fit the mold of the classic video game protagonist. The difference with her is that none of it feels forced or contrived in order to include her, and she's not a one-dimensional character. The game really is built around her, and for the player to experience the game as Senua, and it pulls it off extremely well. In this game, the player is able to experience a story told from someone who's not your typical kind of hero, and yet it plays out in a thoughtful and believable way. The only critiques that I can see with this game is that it's quite short, and I was able to get through the entire thing in just a couple of days. Also, the gameplay side is rather sparse. I personally didn't have an issue with this, as I don't mind interactive movie style games, but it is something you should be aware of going in. If you want a gameplay heavy game or something that requires some real strategy when going into engagements, this isn't going to be it. If you want something that's more of a casual game from a gameplay perspective, but tells a compelling story and looks absolutely amazing, this is a great option, especially if you have an interest in history, mythology, and specifically Nordic mythology. So I really hope you enjoyed this look at Senua Saga Hellblade 2. Have you already played through this one? Let me know down in the comments what you thought, and if you agree or disagree with my own opinion. If the video was helpful or entertaining, please give me a like here, as it really helps me out a lot, and consider subscribing to the channel. I post a bunch of different gaming content, not just reviews but also walkthroughs and other videos, and would love to have you join the community and help direct the future of the channel. Otherwise, thank you so much for taking the time to watch today, and until next time, take care.
She cannot falter. The voices draw her onward. The ones who didn't live. The ones she could not save. She can hear them calling. Lives stolen by the Northmen. She carries them with her, always.
She is afraid, exhausted, scared.